by some mistake, somebody like Corbyn could be elected, he could run the gauntlet and still get elected, we would then have to deal with him. It's better to get rid of him now.
Today, we wanted to talk mainly about the role of America in the world. The most powerful country in history. And you've been at the forefront for decades of activism against the wars that they fought, alongside the Brits and others. But you had experience, I think, in Latin America when you were a young man, where you started to understand how the world really worked and America's role within the world, away from the propaganda we're fed. Can you just describe what that experience was?
It was a fascinating time. This was the mid-1960s. I was living initially in Jamaica, where I was teaching and doing youth work. And that was a time when Jamaica was very much within the US orbit. And Cuba, which you could see from the top of Blue Mountain, Jamaica, was a place that you could not travel to, you could not get there in any way. And Cuba was under blockade then, as it still is now. And there was this huge pressure for an Americanization of so much of society. But I also used the opportunity of reading quite a lot. C. Wright Mills' book, Listen Yankee, was interesting. And all the history of the recent US interventions in Central America, particularly in Honduras and Guatemala, in support of the United Fruit Company, were all the sort of things that were discussed by the left in Jamaica. The left in Jamaica was searching for a Jamaican identity, which was a combination of the developed identity of Jamaica, but also the African roots of the society. And that was a fascinating experience. After that, I went to South America, Latin America, if you will, and from Guyana, I went to meet Cheddi Jagan and talk to them about the coup that was organized against them to prevent them taking office in 1953 when they'd won an election. And I then went from there to Brazil, which was then under military dictatorship and brutal military dictatorship. This was after the killing of students in '64. And the US obvious pressure on Brazil was absolutely huge. And I then from there went to Paraguay and Argentina and Chile and Peru and Bolivia. Chile was, again, different, quite European on the surface compared to the rest of South America. And it was the time that the Popular Unity had been founded, and they were getting ready for the 1970 election, which of course Allende won. And the rest is, as you know, what happened later on, 3 years later. So I saw the degree of military pressure from the US on all of those societies and the huge repression against the left. I went to Bolivia, to the town where Che Guevara had been killed. And when I got off the bus there, I was followed around by two people in sort of strange-looking raincoats. They didn't speak, they just walked about 5 meters behind me wherever I went. They met me off the bus and continued following me. And as I was walking around the bus station to get out of the bus station, there was a big repair pit, which is there for servicing the buses when they come in. And I was pushed into it by these guys. And then everybody sort of looked. Nobody said anything. Nobody helped me. I climbed out, and they continued following me. And they followed me to where I was staying. The following morning, they're there again. They followed me around. And then they saw me get on a bus and leave. And everyone in the town was just silent and quiet. It was just a horrible, eerie atmosphere. This would be sort of 69 period, early 69, so it wasn't long after Che had been killed. And it was the fear of the uprising of people that was what the military in Bolivia feared and what the Americans feared, of course.
And just fast forward into the current period, you were a major figure as a backbench Labour MP in the anti-Iraq war movement. Now that is often characterised as a failure because it failed to stop the war. But do you agree with that, or do you think that the society we live in now has been impacted in maybe imperceptible ways by that major movement? There were 1 million people out on the streets on February 15th, 2003.
No movement of protest is ever a complete failure because you don't know where the seeds of ideas have fallen and what the effect of them will be. Take it historically back. Those people like Juarez, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Keir Hardie, all those that opposed the First World War and paid a huge price for it. Yes, the First World War happened. The anti-war movement maintained and grew again in the 1920s and 1930s. So I think you can't just say that they didn't stop the First World War. Obviously they didn't, but they were there. And they gave people the notion that you could do things differently, you could live in peace. Likewise, those that campaigned in the 1930s in support of Spain against fascism were a very important figure against the rise of fascism, who we now revere. At the time, my mother and father's generation were condemned as being extremist communist sympathizers who were hell-bent on trouble. And so I think you have to sort of think of it in those ways. And then the growth of the peace movement post-war in Britain limited opposition to the establishment of NATO. But again, history plays funny tricks. So in 1948, there was a World Peace Congress in Sheffield. Most history books don't record it at all because it was not wanted by the Labour government of the day or the media of the day. Likewise, in 1945, Pan-African Unity Conference in Manchester, hardly reported in any of the British media, but had massive implications. So protest and what are seen as isolated things carry on. And so take it forward a bit. I was in Parliament from 1983 onwards, and the turning point, the seminal moments were before the Iraq issue, were actually going back to the Gulf War in 1991. I remember talking to Tony Benn about this, and we were saying, look, this doesn't have to be. And we opposed the intervention in the Gulf and said, look, there is a way of getting Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait and so on. But it seemed to me very clear that the British government, and particularly the American government, having moved all these troops into the region, were ready to invade Iraq, and they duly did. We were in a very small minority in Parliament, and whilst there were protests, they were big but not huge. And then we had the occupation of southern Iraq, eventually withdrawn, but the use of depleted uranium weapons created that cancer that's still there. Then move on to 2001. Now 2001, obviously a seminal turning point in world history, no question about that. In the US Congress, there was one person, Barbara Lee, voted against the powers that George Bush wanted given to him, which were given, basically to do anything he liked and launch a war against Afghanistan. The opposition was a bit stronger in Britain, and we mounted what opposition we could in Parliament to it, and we founded the Stop the War Coalition in opposition to the war in Afghanistan, not Iraq. And I was amazed at the numbers of people that turned out to found a Stop the War movement. We were expecting a small meeting of a couple of hundred people, and it was thousands turned out to Friends Meeting House at the time. And then we continued our activities, but it was pretty obvious that with George Bush and his Axis of Evil speech, which was the State of the Union address in 2002, we were then getting ready for the idea there's going to be a ground war in Iraq. So we started opposition during that summer of 2002. And I figured there was something big happening when in September 2002, we had a demonstration in Hyde Park with 200,000 people there, which was big. Not as big as the one that came later. Then we carried on this opposition and eventually had over 1 million people in February 2003, and the opposition of 150 members of parliament, Labour members of parliament, to the war. Again, did we stop the war? No, but it did lay the basis for other governments not to participate. France didn't, Spain didn't, Germany didn't. It became very much a British and American affair.
And it's interesting listening to you because you've got a very critical analysis of US imperialism and the British role. And it's interesting to me that you joined the Labour Party as a young man, because the Labour Party, some would say, is part of the American imperial project, apart from Michael Foot's leadership from 80 to 83 and your own leadership. Every Labour leader post-war has been Atlanticist and been signed up to the American imperial project. So how do you square those two things? Why did you join the Labour Party? Were you aware of this, and did you just think to affect change, it was better to work from the inside?
I was very, very aware of this, and the more I read, the more I understood about what is the role of the post-war Labour government in this pro-American project. Because between the wars from 1920 onwards, the Labour Party had various positions. It changed and changed again and so on, but wasn't totally sold on the whole idea of American hegemony around the world, not by any manner of means. Second World War, it certainly became that, and post-war, very, very close. And the US massive loan to Britain was, I suspect, largely conditional on British support for American foreign policy, and in return they would tolerate the development of the welfare state and all the very great achievements of that post-war Labour government. I joined the Labour Party in the 1960s. I was encouraged by what had happened in the early 60s in opposition to nuclear weapons. I was a member of CND at the time, and that we went into the 64 election supposedly going to get rid of Polaris nuclear weapons. They didn't. They in fact reduced the number, but they kept the nuclear weapons and the principle behind it. But the Wilson government did bring in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or support it. I felt then you could do some stuff to change the Labour Party from the inside, and it was a mass working class party, and I joined and spent a lot of time arguing with the Labour Party about Vietnam, and continued doing that all my life. But I was very keen as leader to change the overall foreign policy direction. Quite difficult, because I inherited policy positions that needed developing and needed changing, but I wanted to set that message out there that we were going to be going on a different, more independent path. I was involved in 1987 with Tony Benn and others in founding the Campaign for Non-Alignment, which was about the idea, essentially following Bandung Conference ideas, following that sort of sense of solidarity, of developing a non-aligned foreign policy where we would not be intrinsically linked to the USA, or for that matter to the Soviet Union. We gained quite a lot of support for that, and then interestingly the Soviet Union collapsed 3 years later. And that was the time when the Warsaw Pact collapsed shortly after that. That was the time to surely rethink military alliances.
And you were the victim of one of the most intense media propaganda campaigns, smear campaigns, probably in peacetime British history. From my perspective, I think that wasn't to do with your sort of mild social democratic proposals. For me, I think that, as you mentioned, you hit the red line for the British and American establishment, which is trying to make Britain an independent country, have an independent foreign policy, and not signed up to the American imperial project. Do you agree with that perception, that that was really the thing that scared the establishment here and in Washington the most?
There was opposition to the domestic policies we had on public ownership, on redistribution of power and wealth, on taxation system, on workers elected to boards of companies. There was a lot of opposition to a lot of that legislation, and there was opposition to the end of privatization in health and education. Yes, there was massive opposition to a lot of that. Much of that we were able to deal with, and in a sense, everything in our manifesto on the domestic front was basically catching up with all the damage that had been done by the Thatcher years in Britain. But the foreign policy issues were ones that really caused the greatest opposition. And Mike Pompeo himself went on to say that by some mistake, somebody like Corbyn could be elected. He could run the gauntlet, meaning the gauntlet of the media, and still get elected. We would then have to deal with him. It's better to get rid of him now. Trump said that I should not become prime minister. Netanyahu said it will not happen. We will not allow it. There was an awful lot of people that said they didn't want it. Now, I set out in terms of foreign policy discussion in a very long meeting in Chatham House during the 2017 campaign. It lasted it was a Q&A with various journalists and academics for nearly 2 hours on foreign policy, in which I mentioned 65 countries apparently during my many answers. And one of them actually said, well, at least he knows the world. Well, that was thought to be actually quite dangerous. So we set out a direction of travel that would be very different. I did oppose the Trump visit, and I did also carry out my pledge of making an apology about the Iraq war on behalf of the Labour Party, and I did that the day the Chilcot inquiry came out. And I did propose a War Powers Act which would give parliamentary accountability to all military deployments. And so there were an awful lot of areas where the military establishment in Britain, as well as the media, were very unhappy. And you might remember there was interesting film shown of British soldiers in Afghanistan shooting at my image as target practice.
How did that make you feel?
Well, I looked at it and I thought, now if that was somebody else they were using as target practice, say a member of the royal family, say a child, say a dog or something, there would be outrage. And I contacted the Ministry of Defence straight away and said, what's going on? They said, oh no, it was a bit of a mistake. The lads got a bit carried away. They didn't really mean it. Well, somebody put the picture there and somebody told them to take aim at it. What also I noticed was some of them were very bad shots. But they were hitting the wrong target.
You had Pompeo, the former director of the CIA, who was then Secretary of State, coming to London and being recorded privately saying, we won't let him become prime minister. You got the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying effectively the same thing. You have Trump, president, saying the same thing. You have British soldiers shooting at your picture. You have MI5 and MI6 briefing against you in the media. Did you feel fear at any point because you were a lone figure at potentially disrupting what was previously a smooth-running machine for these people?
I felt there was an awful lot of pressure on us, and also a very difficult situation within the Parliamentary Labour Party, because even after the 2017 election, I was still in a minority within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and the small number of supporters I had were under an awful lot of pressure as well. But what I did was a strategy of engagement on international issues. I attended every meeting of the Party of European Socialists. I spoke at public meetings of CND and Stop the War, which really upset the Daily Telegraph and others, because I wanted to make the point that the peace movement was part of our lives, part of our democracy, and part of our movement. I fully realised the problems we were going to come under, but I also met quite a lot of people from the military during this time, and that was actually very interesting. I had some very interesting discussions with former soldiers at a number of British Legion halls and things. And they didn't all agree with me, no, but they didn't attack me either. They were very interested, and then we talked about their lives, their mental health stresses, their conditions, their problems having come out of the forces and what happened with it. And some of the other discussions then went on to the role that some of the British Armed Forces had taken in dealing with Ebola in West Africa, and the others in plucking then refugees out of the sea in the Mediterranean. And I sort of said, well, look, the military skills are huge. The capacity is enormous. It can be used for other things. And I'm not saying there's a huge majority who said, yeah, that's a great idea. There were quite a lot who said, well, you know, there is something here we can work on.
And I just wanted to move on as well to there's a military occupation of Britain there's 12,000 US troops here, spread across 11 so-called RAF sites, but they're effectively US Air Force bases.
That comes in part from the Visiting Forces Act.
Exactly, yes.
And from the establishment of NATO. The interesting thing is, 1946, pretty well all US forces left Britain. They were still in Germany, but there may have been logistical movements in and out of Britain, but essentially the US left Britain very quickly after the Second World War. And then in 1948, NATO is founded, and they're suddenly back in Britain in big numbers. They then discovered that it wasn't really a legal basis on which there should be foreign troops stationed in Britain. Bear in mind that had never happened before. In the 19th century, there was nobody's troops there at all. And so the Visiting Forces Act was passed in 1952, I think, which is then the basis on which the US troops are here. And you're right, you think of RAF Lakenheath, think of Upper Heyford, think of many other places around Britain which are effectively very large American bases. And the numbers of troops on those bases has increased, not decreased, recently. And there are the use of Prestwick Airport as a staging post as well. And what was revealed was about extraordinary rendition and the use of Britain in extraordinary rendition, and the use of Diego Garcia, which is theoretically a British RAF base, but you wouldn't know it if ever you went there. And it's now subject to a sort of, how should I put it, a fight back by Britain and the right to try and prevent the ICJ opinion that Mauritius should have sovereignty over the Chagos Islands.
One of the amazing things about the RAF bases, which are effectively US bases, is that you can get access to information through parliamentary questions and other transparency mechanisms about UK action there, and there's a complete block on any information about US action. So they say we don't comment on foreign countries' operations in Britain. Yeah. So they effectively operate as black sites for foreign militaries, our own domestic bases, which is amazing. But do you think if you had become Prime Minister, you would have considered rescinding the invitation to the United States to base that many troops in our country?
Well, I would want to wind down the whole concept of military conflict based in Britain or based anywhere else. So yes, I would have wanted to wind it down and not have all these bases there. And I wanted us to abide by the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which would be to not develop a new generation of nuclear weapons and take steps towards disarmament, which is what the NPT says. Now that was something that I made that very clear. My membership of CND was well known, and my opposition to the use of nuclear weapons was well known, and that created a whole lot of hostility towards me on the basis that somehow or other you're not serious unless you're prepared to destroy the planet.
Yeah, and
it's a very strange debate to have.
It is. And
I was actually, there was 2 days, that, I think it was 2 days running, the Daily Telegraph said that I was a great threat to the world because I would have my finger on the nuclear button. Then the next one, they said I was a great threat to Britain's safety because I wouldn't use it.
One of the most amazing parts of your leadership of the Labour Party for me was there was a debate in the House of Commons about Trident renewal, I think, and there was so much animosity from both sides at you, and you were just sort of standing there saying, well, I don't think maybe nuclear war is not a great idea. And they couldn't, and they couldn't understand it. And I just thought,
you watched the debate,
like future generations, if they exist, will just look at this and think, wow, he's the only sane person in the asylum.
I remember that very well.
Yeah, it was powerful.
Summer 2016,
Yeah.
Theresa May decided to ask for a parliamentary endorsement for something they'd already endorsed. It was a way of creating a debate, knowing full well the problems I would have. And so it was, you know, I'd got a lot of sympathy with Daniel when he went in the lion's den. But it was an interesting day. Did you enjoy watching it?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was powerful. But I mean, I thought
it was very
I felt
hard to
sorry
make
for you because you were in the midst of such.
It was very hard to make a speech.
Yeah, I remember.
I mean, I'd get 2 sentences out, and then there would be another uproar, more trouble, more interruptions.
Yeah, I mean, you had that for four or 5 years, didn't you?
But you got used to it, so.
But to follow on from that question, because we talked about the US military presence in the UK, which we've never voted on, by the way. It's never been a referendum, and we're not allowed to know what happens there. NATO's maritime command is also just in West London. Not many people know that. But there's also interference in the political system to stop someone like you rising up to where you did rise, and you could have gone on to be Prime Minister. And one of the main institutions I've looked at in terms of that has been something called the British American Project, which I'm not sure you're aware of. This was founded in 1983 with US embassy funding initially, and it was at a time when CIA had declassified files, and they said they were particularly worried about the rise of the left and the...
It goes back a bit further to World War II time when the British American Parliamentary Assembly was established, and that was established by resolution of the US Congress and of the British Parliament. The idea being this was cementing the special relationship of the Second World War. And I must say, when I was first elected Parliament, I was always puzzled as to why we had this British American Parliamentary Assembly, which is a way of taking a lot of MPs and Lords to the USA on incredibly long and very expensive visits, and all of which involves discussions with the Defense Department and so on. And then the later thing that was established in '83 is a more intense version of the same thing.
And many people, it's still around now, and many people who were the senior, was sort of the most outspoken critics of your leadership were affiliated. People like Peter Mandelson, Ruth Smee. Well, actually, Ruth Smee's husband was a senior figure in it. How powerful do you think something like the British American Project is in Britain? Do you think? Because I get different interpretations of that. Some people say it's extremely powerful, but some people say, well, it doesn't. It's irrelevant.
I'm not sure it's that powerful. It exists. It's there. It's part of one of the many tools of the US military and US policy lobbying that goes on in Britain. I think it's more important that we try to put into people's minds the concept of a different way of doing things, of a more peaceful way of doing things, of less spending on military expenditure, not more. That to me is more important. I mean, it's also the lack of scrutiny about a lot of what goes on in Parliament, because I tried to introduce a War Powers Bill, War Powers Act, into Parliament, because actually the government can take us to war without any parliamentary approval at all. It can be done using the royal prerogative. And I remember working with Tony Benn on the Governance of Britain Bill, in which we would bring the royal prerogative under parliamentary scrutiny. This is historically the power of the Crown to decide everything, now operated by the Prime Minister and all ministers. Royal prerogative is a very powerful weapon in the hands of a government which can bypass Parliament. Also, Parliament, most people see it as a sovereign body holding the government to account. Yes, in part, but in reality, Parliament can only meet if the government approves of it meeting. And so I remember going to see John Bercow as Speaker to say I wanted Parliament recalled. Now, remember, I was speaking as Leader of the Opposition, representing obviously a very substantial number of MPs in that sense, wanting Parliament recalled. And he said, "I'm really sorry, Jeremy, I don't have the power to recall Parliament. I'm only the Speaker." The only person that can recall Parliament is the Prime Minister, who can decide whether that should happen or not. So I think we do need to look at the democratic systems we have in Britain, which is why Shami Chakrabarti and I worked very hard on preparing a War Powers Bill, and as a way of bringing greater parliamentary scrutiny.
And one of the major unaccountable institutions, or there's a series of them, but the major unaccountable institutions in our society in terms of government are the intelligence agencies as well. Yeah. And so you've got MI5, MI6, GCHQ, Defence Intelligence, and as a journalist trying to get any information about what they do is next to impossible. Then you've got the Special Forces, which is even harder. And you have, from Washington, the CIA and others. I mean, as we talked about earlier on with your formative years in Latin America and watching how the CIA were involved in the overthrow of democratic socialist governments like Allende in Chile, Goulart in Brazil in '64. Do you I mean, I don't want you to have to speculate, you don't have to speculate, but do you assume that they were working, the CIA particularly, was working against your leadership of the Labour Party, or at least thinking about you as a threat? Like they did Michael Foot, that has come out.
It was very clear to me, and you look at the Al Jazeera files and Labour files, the programme on Al Jazeera and others, there were a lot of people working very strongly against us. Were the US working actively against us? Yes, I'm sure they were. I did meet the US ambassadors. I did meet a US congressional delegation when they came to Britain. I had a very long meeting with Nancy Pelosi and the whole delegation in my office one Sunday afternoon, because that was the only time they could do. And did we agree on stuff? No, not really. There were two things that came out of it. One was a big disagreement over Palestine and the Middle East, in which I set out my view that the occupation should end. Interestingly, when it came to other issues surrounding European politics, they were more interested in what would happen to the Northern Ireland Agreement than anything else. Now, they were right about that. The Northern Ireland Agreement is an important thing to defend and support. Was there hostility from them? Yeah, there was quite a lot of hostility. Most of them were quite polite. Not all.
And just to go back to what you're saying about the role Labour plays in the American imperial project, I mean, one example of that at the moment is the genocide in Gaza, which has been a brutal assault for 7 months now. And you have your shadow Brexit secretary, now leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, his shadow foreign secretary, David Lammy, and many other senior figures in Labour effectively supporting this genocide from the beginning. Has that shocked you?
No, it hasn't shocked me, because I know where many of these people are coming from. During one extremely hostile meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party Committee, they confronted me and said, "Will you give a blanket undertaking that you, as party leader and potentially Prime Minister, will automatically support any military action Israel undertakes?" And I said, "No, I will give no such undertaking. I will give no such agreement." because the issue of Palestine has to be resolved, and the Palestinian people do not deserve to live under occupation. And the siege of Gaza has created the most incredible stress. And by the way, I've been there on 9 occasions in Israel, Palestine, and the West Bank. When the Israeli forces started attacking Gaza after October the 7th, October the 7th was wrong, and the response of killing tens of thousands of people doesn't bring anybody back, and has created the hatred and the wars of tomorrow and the year after and the year after. So was I surprised at this support for Israel? No, because the pressure of Israel on the Israeli government, on the Labour Party, is huge. But then again, there's also some wonderful people in Israel who very bravely oppose what their government is doing and oppose the occupation. But I was absolutely shocked when remarks were made which appeared to me to undermine the whole principle of international law, of the bombing of civilian targets is a war crime. I went to the International Court of Justice hearing in The Hague. I sat through the whole of it. It was fascinating. It was like a lesson in international law, and it was brilliantly presented by South Africa. Surely, if Israel is not agreeing with the UN General Assembly, not agreeing with the Security Council, not agreeing with the International Court of Justice, and is already in breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention on the authority of occupying powers, then surely we should be thinking about why are we giving all this military support to Israel. We now have this bizarre situation where President Biden has said that he will not supply US bombs to be used in Rafah, and Britain, Lord Cameron, has said that Britain will supply them, irrespective of the rulings of the ICJ or anybody else. So the protests around the world are making a difference. Biden would not have said that without all the protests at US campuses.
I wanted to ask you about the slavish support for Israel, which you're describing from Britain, which is now even more slavish than Washington. Because there's a topic that many people don't want to talk about, but you were a victim of it, which is that the Israeli state has a very, very powerful lobby in this country, in the sense of lobbying for its interests and destroying critics of Israeli policy or the UK support for it. Having been leader for nearly 4.5 years, how powerful do you think the Israel lobby is in this country? And obviously I'll qualify that by saying many countries around the world have lobbies in this country, and they're of different powers.
As you're quite right, many countries do a great deal of lobbying and spend an awful lot of time lobbying MPs in the interests of their own country. The USA does it. In the past, the Soviet Union used to do it. Russia did it, not now. Israel has been an ever-present lobby for Israel's military needs, as they put them, and attempts always to justify the continued occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. And even when Oslo had been agreed, they haven't carried it out. I mean, there are many in Palestine who don't agree with Oslo anyway, but even with the agreement reached at Oslo, Israel has not carried it out. I remember talking to my friend Mustafa Barghouti, the Palestine National Initiative, a sort of independent figure within Palestinian politics. I said, well, Mustafa, if you became president of the Palestine Authority, what would you do? He said, well, I wouldn't be able to do anything. I don't control the borders. I don't control security. I don't have an army. I only have money that comes in by the largesse of Israel. I'm not sure I'd have any authority to do anything. He said, we are not an independent functioning state. We're a place under occupation. I would be becoming president of an occupied territory, and that's how I'd have to deal with it. I've also often met people from the Knesset and others who have strongly opposed the occupation and said, actually, it's not in Israel's long-term interests to carry on with this military activity in Palestine, because it ends up making us a security state and it doesn't actually make us secure.
But do you think that the power of the pro-Israel lobby in this country and also in the United States makes it impossible for politicians like yourself, who don't have a radical position on Israel-Palestine, you support a two-state solution, which is the official policy of the UK government, makes it impossible for them to rise to any position of prominence or at least achieve success, become prime minister, become president, because they're pumping so much money into the polity. And for example, to be specific about it, Labour Friends of Israel, which you know, which doesn't reveal its funders, but counts, I think, over a third of Labour MPs and members, when MPs are young in their career, they've just entered Parliament, they pay for them to go to Israel and get propaganda tours of Israel. So you cultivate the whole generation.
And that happens
that needs to stop, does it not? Is that not an attack on British sovereignty? Not just by Israel, by the Saudis do it too. The regime in Riyadh pay for politicians to come.
Well, absolutely. The power of persuasion of people to join Labour Friends of Israel and go on a delegation to Israel is huge, and it's all funded from the very day you're elected. You're invited to go on these visits and delegations, and I've always had a rule that I will not go on a delegation anywhere funded by another government. Any government, and I don't. If I travel anywhere, I either pay for it myself or go on funding by a non-governmental organisation. That's my personal rule that I stick by. The Israel pressure is huge, but it's also commercial pressure, because the arms trade with Israel, which the government says is not very great, it was only £45 million in 1 year of exports. Nevertheless, there are Israeli manufacturing facilities in Britain that has been exposed, and there is this huge security cooperation with Israel, and we're now learning of the number of flights that have been made by the RAF over Gaza. Now, they weren't all dropping aid. They were doing surveillance. For what? And where was that information going back to? And there is a sort of, there's a very colonial mentality that still pervades Parliament. There was one occasion when a Tory MP got up and said, well, look, what we need is a series of Arab countries to take over the running of Gaza, and we'll appoint a governor. The idea was you'd sort of appoint a colonial governor to run Gaza, with administration being provided by presumably Qatar and UAE and so on. Sort of a whole colonial mentality. But the same colonial mentality is in telling the Palestinian people what their state should be and what their configuration should be in the future. Surely we should be saying we're against occupation.
Were you aware that in the WikiLeaks cables it was revealed that Ruth Smee, who was one of the major critics of you, was revealed in one cable as an informant for the US Embassy? Did you see that?
I didn't know that until that came out.
Yeah.
The WikiLeaks cables are interesting.
Did that surprise you?
On reflection, no. Though at the time I was surprised, but on reflection, no. With her behaviour and her hostility towards me was.
She'd previously also worked for Israel lobby company called.
Yeah, I knew she'd worked for them. Although she and others always claimed that they were actually trying to moderate Israel's behaviour towards Palestinians.
Yeah. Were you surprised by the interview Keir Starmer gave on LBC, where he was asked, does Israel have the right to withdraw water and electricity from 1 million children? And he said, Israel does have that right. Did that surprise you?
I was totally shocked by that reply. It's absolutely clear in every aspect of law, never mind morality, that you don't bomb schools, you don't destroy water supplies, you don't cut off electricity. And he said, this is legitimate self-defense. It's not. It's a war crime.
And the journalist who has done more than anyone in history to expose the actions of the US empire, the US war machine, is Julian Assange, who has now been sitting in Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London for over five years. Can you talk about his significance and the significance of the work that he did, and also the persecution that the British government has been complicit in by the US?
Julian Assange has done massive work on exposing so many war crimes, not just by the US, but by other governments as well. And the information that he's revealed is of huge significance around the world. He, as you know, has now been 5 years in HMP Belmarsh. I went to see him there last year with Len McCluskey. We had an hour and a half in discussion about his work, about his life, and about the importance of revealing what are the really powerful forces in the world. And he is being persecuted because he told the truth. And the case comes up again in court. I obviously don't know the outcome of that. What I do know is it would be totally wrong for him to be removed from British jurisdiction and put in a maximum security prison in the USA. He should be released.
And in terms of the future, because I know you've been involved in supporting liberation movements in Latin America for a long time, which are also facing huge pressures internally, but also externally from the US and others. Is that where you look to get hope? So you've got, since 1999, you've had Chavez, you've had Lula twice, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Petro now in Colombia. What do you think, if there's a future that is good, it's going to come from Latin America? Would you say that?
Globally, there is a lot of hope. I'm part of Progressive International. I'm a member of the board of Progressive International, and obviously we work with Petro, with Lula, and so on. I'm very involved in Mexico through my wife and visits there, and there is a change all over Latin America, which is huge and significant. The way in which poverty levels have reduced in Bolivia and in Brazil, and the way in which there is a presence on the world stage of those governments, such as their support for the South African application to the ICC. But I think people sometimes say, well, where's your inspiration, where's your hope, and so on, and they sort of cast around the world and say, things are going really well here, really well there. I mean, I'm a great admirer of the late Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and many of the very brave African leaders. I thought Julius Nyerere was an incredible African leader in what he tried to achieve and the inspiration he gave. But you know what? Look for your inspiration next door, look for it in your street, look for it in your community, because it is, at the end of the day, about how your community reacts to poverty, how it reacts to the fact that in wealthy Britain, we've got 1 million people needing to access food banks. It's those kind of campaigns, and from that grows. And what has inspired me over the past 6 months, with all the horrors, and they are vile, the horrors of what's happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza, it's the tens of thousands of people that have continually come out on demonstrations week after week, all over Britain, most of Europe, and now huge numbers in the USA, and huge demonstrations in South Africa and other places. That is an understanding of what global power is about, and them wanting to express their solidarity. And you know what? It's changed a lot of things.
But obviously as well, I agree with that, and it's the people are the heroes and they should be the leaders. But we do need leaders, and we do have leaders, and you are a leader now, not just here but globally for the left and progressive forces. What do you see your future as in terms of politics? Because obviously you're not sitting as a Labour MP now, but we're going to have the likely election of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. And in my belief is that things are going to get quite interesting soon after, because the country has been sold this lie effectively that for years, that if we get rid of the Tories, everything will be all right, Labour will sort it out. And people are going to realise very quickly that that Labour government is doing stuff that's barely different to the Tories. And then I believe you personally will become one of the most relevant politicians in Britain.
Well, don't worry, I'm not disappearing.
Yeah, are you ready? Are you ready for it?
I'm absolutely ready for it. I'll just say this. If both front benches are agreed on continuing inequality in Britain, if both front benches are agreed on impoverishing children because they're in large families, then something bad is missing. We need an alternative.
And are you going to stand?
I'll be around. I'm going to be around. I'm available for service.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us.